Hello, and welcome to Workplace Stories, the podcast where human capital experts share their real-world experiences and insights. Hosted by Red Thread Research, Workplace Stories surfaces the latest industry trends, innovative talent strategies, and best practices for success. Tune in for practical advice on how to best transform your workplace.
Welcome to Workplace Stories. We just finished a conversation with author Greg Pryor, who was talking to us about his forthcoming book, The Social Capital Imperative. And I want to be clear, forthcoming, you can't Google it yet. It's coming out in March. But really wonderful conversation. Danny, what did you learn?
So much. We've known Greg for years, and I've followed his work in Connected Commons and all the things, but he used the word stupiphanies, which are things that are so stupid that you should know right away, but you hear them and then you're like, oh my gosh, that's amazing. And I had a couple of those. Like one of them is the simple, he talked a lot about people or actually how you get things done. So in this world today, when everybody is focused on technology and simplification and efficiency and all that kind of stuff, he and his research partners are heading back to people and networks is how you actually get things done. I thought that was really key. The other thing that really struck me is the optimism for the future of technology to augment people. So he's a network guy. He talks about networks within organizations and personal networks that people have. And when he talks about technology, it's palpable how excited he is that this technology is going to help us get better networks and solve problems through the networks rather than relying on the technology itself. And that really stood out to me. How about you?
I love how he talked about outcomes, having an outcome focus for social network work. So when we talk a lot about organizational network analysis, which we do in the people analytics tech work, a lot of times it's just kind of use this amazing tech, which has these pretty charts to understand something. Sometimes there's a specific use case like an M&A or there's a leadership challenge. But the way that he talked about it was much more specific around what types of business outcomes are you trying to enable? Like, overall, are you trying to enable greater career velocity? Are you trying to enable bringing up more underrepresented folks into these types of roles? Whatever it is, but just being very specific about the outcomes you're trying to drive through networks. And then from that beginning, creating networks or understanding the networks that exist and evolving them. So I really like that outcome focus. The other thing he talks about and is in this book is there are, I believe it's 9 different types of use cases for which you can use network analysis in things like some of the ones that I just mentioned, but also things like looking at teams, looking at culture, looking at change management, et cetera. And the entire book is focused around being highly practical and making network analysis accessible, which it hasn't necessarily been in kind of generation 1, as he called it. So with this book, he's trying to help move us all to generation 2 of more practical, accessible network analysis. And I really appreciated that. So for those of you who are listening, we hope you love this episode. Greg's energy is infectious, and we enjoyed the time with him immensely, and we're sure you will as well. If you enjoy the podcast, please go ahead and like and subscribe and do all those good things. And if you want to continue the conversation, join the Red Thread membership, where we will continue to talk about all of these topics because they are really important and they're also exciting. Thanks so much.
If you like what you heard today, check out our Red Thread Research membership. We have a wonderful community. We have studies and research that we publish on a range of people practices as well as HR technology. And we also have discussions on a regular basis, including virtual meetups and all sorts of other things to get you connected to the insights you need to solve your biggest people problems. Check us out at members.redthreadresearch.com.
Welcome, Greg, to Workplace Stories. We're so excited that you're here to join us. Is this your second or third time with us?
It is. I don't know, like what is it Saturday Night Live where you get like, is it your 5th show that you get like into the, like along with Steve Martin or something?
Jacket,
so
yeah.
I'm wondering, you could tell me later who I've got to catch up with to be in the inner circle of your podcast. It's a privilege to be here for a second time.
Well, for what it's worth, we don't have any velvet jackets or anything. It's just a ball cap, maybe a keychain. So don't get too excited.
We do have some pretty good Red Thread mugs, though.
That's true.
Yeah. So there's that. We know you obviously very well, but our audience may not yet. So can you start off by telling us a bit about yourself and particularly why you're here with us today?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you again for having me back a second time. Hopefully that first time went well enough to have me back. It's a privilege to be with. And a little bit of background on myself. I live in New Jersey now. I had lived in California for many, many years, where I know both of you all. Recently moved back to the East Coast. I've got 2 adult children, one who is a kindergarten teacher. Kindergarten started today in New Jersey. And so she's got her new kindergarten teacher starting today. And the other is a labor and delivery nurse at NYU. So I'm surrounded by amazing children, and my wife and I are so proud of them. It's incredible. I've had the privilege of a 30-year plus career in the talent and leadership and culture, what I sort of call TLC space. And that's how we know each other. I've had the privilege of working with organizations like Accenture and Merrill Lynch and Juniper Networks, and then retired from Workday. Most recently, had the privilege to work with my good friend, Kristen Cullen-Lester. We were commissioned by SIOP. Many of your listeners may know SIOP, the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychologists, to curate a book on applied social network science. And we called the book The Social Capital Imperative, Revealing, Developing, and Leveraging Organizational Networks. It's going to be published in March, in the March timeframe. And I'm happy to join you and your amazing audience to talk about how social network science and organization networks can be used to solve some of today's most pressing organizational challenges, and hopefully inspire some folks to leverage that tool or to double down or to reuse that tool if they've already been using it.
So, Greg, that was a great bio and lots of energy. So awesome. Tell me now why we should listen to you.
So what I can tell you is, having worked at companies like Accenture and Merrill Lynch and Workday, I have worked with some of the smartest people in the room, as the saying goes. And I can say with absolute confidence that I am not one of those smartest people in the room. But why should you listen to me? Is I stay incredibly focused on spending time with and learning from super smart people and interesting people, and really connecting the dots on their insights. I've had the privilege of learning from the 2 of you, and you're connected to this amazing network. I've learned from my good friends and partners, Michael Arena and Rob Cross, who some of your audience may know. Grateful for my friendship and inspiration from John Boudreau. So I really spend a lot of my time curating, again, these ideas from other really smart people. And I'm looking forward today to sharing some of the things that we learned through nearly 50 diverse experts that we had the opportunity to curate on the book, to think about how they're applying networks. So whether that's from the Mayo Clinic, from NASA, MD Anderson Cancer Center, or some super cool pioneering work that's happening at Roche. So I would say my superpower is connecting and aggregating trending perspectives from others, and candidly probably never had an original idea myself. So I'll leave it at that.
That is not true. We know that's not true.
Or it is true, but nobody else has either. I think it's fun. And I think it's fun as you were listing all those folks. I think almost all of them we've had on the podcast. We are coming up on the high 80s, 90s. Some of them just don't know. Either that or it's middle age, but we're not going to think that. But, which actually reminds me, though, that we should get Michael back on, because he has published also some interesting things that are in the book. But before we go down that path, what is the social capital imperative? And particularly because you know that I am a measurement person and love measurement, how do you measure social capital?
Maybe I could take just a moment and do a little bit of level setting on what is social network science and organizational science. I'm sure folks in this audience are generally familiar with it, but maybe I'll just take a moment. What I would say is, based on the research, I would suggest that perhaps as high as 50% of our success and the outcomes we achieve are actually enabled from our connections and our network. For centuries, as the 2 of you know, and so many folks who are listening today, professional success was mostly attributed to our human capital, what we know. And an often underanalyzed and perhaps underappreciated element of impact is social capital, how what we know is unleashed through who we know. So we increasingly believe that there is this opportunity to think about our networks. I'm going to take it from the sort of theoretical to practical for a moment, and perhaps with an unexpected example. You may know, if you're a music follower, that over the past several weeks, rapper Post Malone has occupied the top spots on the country music charts with his new album, which is, if you just landed down from space from an alien planet, you'd be surprised to see that. While part of Post's success is his talent, the album is a crossover success, in large part because of his connections and his network. As you know, if you follow this at all, the album is loaded with Nashville A-listers from multiple generations, from Dolly Parton, who I admire so deeply, through Tim McGraw, even down to more contemporary folks like Jelly Roll. The songs were all cooked up on Music Row by clusters of veteran country hit makers, and the fingers on the fiddle belong to sort of a Muscle Shoals session of players in the genre. Ironically, if you're familiar with it, its lead single with Morgan Wallen is I Had Some Help, which features the refrain, teamwork makes the dream work. And it's become one of the most successful songs of the summer, if not of the year. And so when I think about that situation, what Post, I can't speak to his musical ability, but intentionally combining his musical capabilities with these iconic country connections helped him develop and leverage this sort of network to create authenticity through association, legitimacy through collaboration, and to generate this pull from musical leaders who had strong country roots. And so while his talent may be necessary, they probably would have been insufficient to have him achieve such success as measured by chart performance in this case. So this really, for me, is a very modern, interesting example of the idea of leveraging social networks. And I believe his collaboration, his intentionality doing that really accelerated a crossover success that if you just relied on your musical capability, probably would not have happened. So maybe jumping back to the world of work for a moment, in the book, Kristen and I really theorize that there are three fundamental shifts or forces that are placing a premium on social capital, or this idea of productive collaboration. The first is automation, augmentation, and the atomization of work by AI. And if you had our good friend John Boudreau on, he was absolutely talking about that. The second is the rise in recognition that agility is the new operating requirement for organizational stability. And the third is that this idea of collaborative access, and I'm sure you talked with our good friend Rob about this, that access anytime and anywhere is leading to these alarming levels of collaborative overload, as well as threats to our well-being. And so what we've done in this book, what we're looking to do through this body of work, is to really energize, perhaps even inspire people to add the social capital lens to their heritage, human capital lens, to really begin solving this area that's increasingly a premium. And I know we're going to get more into that, but maybe just to set the table, I'll put that out.
So before we go to the next question, I'm going to take us off track. When you told us you were going to talk about Post Malone, both Danny and I were like, ooh, But now in hearing what you said, what it made me think of, and also a connection to Beyonce's album, Cowboy Carter, is how important network connectors are and kind of primary influencers within a network. Because in both the Post Malone example and with Beyonce's, it was Dolly Parton who opened the door and basically led the way in setting the example for other artists, because both of them have a bunch of country artists on them, to embrace and make welcome these people who are traditionally from other genres, or to use our parlance, other networks. It's so interesting.
And Stacia, I know we were going to get into this a little bit later, but let's pull that red thread right now. Right? what we're here to do is what we know through the network science, and we're going to talk about this hopefully a little bit later related to organizational change or transformation or influences. There are this disproportionately small number of energizing influencers, and they have to specifically be, and Dolly Parton, role model. If Michael Arena is listening somewhere right now, his heart is warm, has grown 10 times the size. These relatively small number of energizing influencers, they have to be both energizing and influencers, positioned within the network, can have this really disproportionate impact on influencing, disrupting, diffusing new ideas, or welcoming. I'm a recovering change management professional, having spent nearly 10 years at Accenture. And back in the day, we used to take a bit more of a theoretical approach and say, let's find some number of influencers in our network who can do this change management work. But we didn't know at the time was we didn't look at their networks. We didn't think about who they were as people. And I had an example recently. We were working with a group of folks and they said, we've got this amazing high quality group of change management professionals who have all of this good time and energy to do this work to drive our transformation. And we said, boy, that's unusual because in our experience, the energizing influencers rarely have time. They're often very much in demand. And what these folks said was, these folks are all brand new to the company. And so that's why they have all this time. And we said, you might want to think about this network. To your point, are these, we didn't know it back when we would do it, but are these the Dolly Partons? Are these the people who are going to open up these doors? There are these mathematically identifiable people, let's call them the Dolly Partons of the world, who can disproportionately open up doors. And when you focus on those folks, engage those folks to do this change efforts, it's a completely different game. And I think the Beyonce example, to your point, and the Post Malone is, Michael might add to his latest book, Find Your Dolly Parton, might be the way to talk about that. But
I think we've just named his next book. Michael, when you're listening, this is the next name. We had somebody who you might know, Ashley Goodall, on.
I know Ashley very well. And
so he was talking about his new book, which he was kind enough to call Danny and I out in the acknowledgments. And in that episode, we named his next book as well. So we've kind of got a history of deciding what should come next here on Workplace Stories. Okay, I know I just took us way off track. Okay,
well, I'm going to keep on taking us off track because I think there are a couple of things here that are really interesting. First is just an observation. I feel like I've been hearing this idea of connection a lot more, Greg. So obviously you and Rob and some of Michael, some of you who are doing some of this work and have been for a while are having an impact, because I had a conversation with a guy Clint Goford, if you know who that is.
I know Clint for many years very well.
Okay.
Might say we're all in the same network.
We were talking a little bit about his new company, and he was talking about leadership, and he basically named 3 things that are crucial for leadership. The first is character. The second is capabilities. Everybody knows that. But the third one that he brought in is connections. Like, a leader, to be truly effective, needs the connections, kind of like we've been talking about. The other thing really struck me when I was reading your second trend, the idea of recognition of agility as an operating requirement for organizational stability. This is something that we've been thinking a lot about. We're doing some research on learning strategies and how learning gets batted around quite a bit. Like they have to align to a business strategy, blah, 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 blah. And so a lot of people, when they think of agility and stability, they are on the spectrum, right? You're either agile or you're stable. And what you're saying here is, no. You got to be agile in order to be stable.
Danny, I have to give full credit to, again, I have no new ideas, is McKinsey talked about that 5 years ago, was that agility was the new stability, that was the way to, for the time I spent in San Diego, when you go out surfing, you ride the wave, you find the energy of that, you use and leverage that energy. I really think that's going to be increasingly true, to your point. And I do think one of the things that we're going to find is that the frequency by which we're on new teams, in new roles, on new projects is going to grow dramatically. So this idea that Michael and I could refer to as social agility, being able to quickly build those relationships, is going to be at a greater premium than it would have been 10 or 20 years ago, when the hierarchy was primarily what drove the way work gets done. Today, I would say at least 50% of the way work gets done is through your network. Not that the hierarchy goes away, but these two ideas exist together, to your point. And that agility to move onto a new team, to quickly build a relationship. We don't have the time for that old storming, forming, norming, performing. I mean, the project is done by the time we go through that cycle. That was right and appropriate for a previous generation of work. But today we need to hit the ground running, build quick relationships, and deliver results very quickly.
So it seems like this is kind of the perfect time for this message, because I don't know, it feels like a perfect storm. Do you guys feel like you've been pushing against a rock for like 20 years and then all of a sudden people are listening?
We do, actually, Danny. You've got that right. I think the challenge has been, I think it's time. What I hope we're doing now, and what I see people is doing, is actually, and this I know is the work you all do, is beginning with the outcomes. Mm-hmm. Starting with saying, what are we trying to do? There has been Rob, Ron Burt, Dan Brass, an amazing group of people, Michael, others, who have done incredible work in building this first generation capability. I hope that we're at the beginning of leaders now in the second generation of this capability, addressing it to business outcomes that are required. In the book, we talk about 9 very specific outcomes that are important to organizations. And we begin with that end in mind, and then come back into the science, back into the research, back into the details and that. But we start with, what is the impact? As an example, one of the 9 areas is around career management. Some recent research would suggest that 49% of your career success is based on your network. And so when you look and you say, what I'm trying to solve for or address is more agile career management or more career well-being, as Gallup identified in their book not too long ago. And then you look and you say, what roles do networks play in this? And then how do you actually reveal your network, develop your network, and then leverage your network toward those outcomes? And I know one of Stacia's favorite things is measuring and measurement of outcomes. Then start with that outcome you want to see, and then describe how do networks play a role. And maybe they don't. Maybe it's more purely capabilities. Maybe it's not connections.
I also wonder, it's on the organization to figure out how to make those networks work, right? So we've done some research on the difference between women's networks and men's networks, and Stacia can speak more to this than I can, but they don't just happen, and they can't, I don't think, I'd love your opinion on this, they can't just be the impetus of the individual to build that network. There are forces at work that determine networks.
I would say, to your point, I actually believe that there are benefits at the individual, at the team, and at the organizational level. I actually believe there are benefits at the societal level, but Stacia tells me we got to draw a line on our impact, right? Let's keep it this. So I'll veer off just for 1 second. So as I mentioned, I'm a recovering consultant. So I see the world in 2x2 matrix. I think the first generation of work in this space, Danny, has been related to, if the axis is sort of organization, individual, and it's analysis, action, we've been in the lower left-hand quadrant in organizational analytics. The opportunity, I believe, for all of us is to take this domain and perhaps most importantly, put it in the action individual quadrant. Give individuals' actions the ability to reveal their own network and see what's happening, to then develop that network in ways, whether it's a gender network, whether it's a diversity network, whether it's an innovation network. Be intentional. What type of a network, in what context am I looking to develop? And then how do I leverage that? That can be leveraged as an individual for career development. It can be leveraged as an organization, as we just talked about, for change management, for inclusion, for leadership effectiveness. And for a team, it can be leveraged in knowledge sharing, in the discovery of new ideas. So I believe, to your point, there are benefits to individuals, to teams, and to organizations based on the context or the outcome you're trying to achieve.
This outcome-driven approach, I am, as you would expect, so for. And I cannot underscore. But let me put a little framework around why. So one of the pieces of research that we did, I think in maybe the first or second year that we had Red Thread, was a piece I collaborated on with Inga Carboni, Dr. Inga Carboni, another amazing researcher in this space. And what we were looking at was specifically women's networks and how technology could potentially enable those networks. A few things for me came out of that research that were important, but maybe controversial. The big one was around ERGs, because you all know we care about DEIB a great amount. And a lot of times people are encouraged to join ERGs because it's going to expand your network, it's going to help you with career building, et cetera. And in this work that we did, what occurred to me was the purpose of an ERG network, or the expected outcome, is not actually that. It is not actually likely to grow your career in the way that it's being sold. And the reason for that is because if you actually understand networks, unfortunately, ERGs tend to have large networks of traditionally underrepresented folks who are lower in the power structure. What happens is you build a network of other folks who are in the same place, but they're not connected enough into these higher power networks. That is not to say ERGs are bad. Please, nobody take that away. But what it does mean is that ERGs, the network, aligns you with other people who can validate your experience, help you navigate your experience, do all these great things that are super duper important. But are they the best way to get advanced in your career, to enhance your career network? Maybe not. Maybe there are other ways that actually connect you with other connectors and a broad range of connectors who will be more able to help with some of those more complicated high power network dynamics. The other part of this that came out of it, which I think is a brilliant idea, but nobody has picked up. So if anybody's out there listening, please take this one. And this is the idea of multiple mentors to multiple mentees, because then in a traditional mentor relationship, you're just caught with one single mentor, one power broker, if you will. Whereas if you have multiple mentors, you're able to make that connection with many people and you're not kind of bottleneck and all this stuff. But like this stuff, like we have to think about networks in the context of the thing we're trying to do, because if we don't, we're going to expect one thing and then get something else.
Stacey, well, first of all, thank you for bringing up our good friend Inga. I am such a fan, and not only of her as a person, but her work is extraordinary. And these are the discussions as human capital professionals, as organizational effectiveness professionals. The thread you just pulled there, I just think is absolutely brilliant. If you look at our friend Chris Ernst's work on boundary spanning leadership, he exactly talks about this topic as well and says, what ERGs can bring you is psychological safety, a sense of belonging. But to your point, they don't, in fact, achieve the ultimate outcome of perhaps career velocity. You need to add on to that then diverse networks, open network. Very often when we think about network science, ERGs can tend to be more closed networks. They're more homogeneous. That is wonderful for building psychological safety. And that's the first step. If I don't have psychological safety, I'm unlikely to be successful. So to your point, when you look at the research behind this, we hope it doesn't get overly complicated. I think that's been one of the places where it's broken down. Inga would be an example of someone who does a brilliant job in sharing it in very consumable ways. What I'd love to see, Stacia, to your point, what I hope to see is that things like generative AI, things like new technology that's available are going to take those insights and convert them into action. Hey, Greg, it looks like you're maybe over-relying on your ERG for your career success. Here's where that's helpful and you should leverage it. Here's where you might need to complement that with an open and more diverse network that spreads your reputational risk, as an example, sort of a call out to Ron Burt's great work on that. So anyway, I think that's been one of the things that's held us back to your earlier point. Maybe it was Danny's earlier point on why haven't we seen more adoption of these ideas? I think in the first generation of work, it's all brilliant, but it was a little bit hard to consume. I hope we're going to move into the next generation like Inga has done and said, okay, as an individual, as a team, or as an organization, let me almost put this more in outcome oriented. I want to increase the effectiveness of career, of promotion velocity among diverse groups of people. How would I do that as an outcome? And then how do I measure that as an example? I'm excited about that. I hope we're on the verge of ingesting and interpreting the research and then applying it in actionable ways against individuals' specific networks.
Mm-hmm. The other thing about that is the tech is beautiful. You get these gorgeous pictures, but there's a big, like, so what component. And it's like this odd catch-22 because you don't want ugly pictures, right? But there's been this lack of clarity on what do I do next with this network map.
What Michael refers to as the arts and the charts are they're fascinating at first blush, but then you become so overwhelmed by trying to analyze and interpret them that you don't then have the disposable attention to go take action. I really think, and what we talk about in the book is this idea of outcomes, insights, and actions. And what we're looking for is a virtuous versus a vicious cycle of those. You want to reveal the insights, but then very quickly make those actionable in pursuit of some measurable outcome. I'm hoping that the future of this space starts to see more of that play out, the idea of outcomes I'm trying to achieve, insights that matter against those outcomes, actions I can take, and that gets a virtuous versus a vicious cycle going.
So I actually want to take us back to the question that's written, our second question. Because I think this plays a little bit into here, Greg. So I'm going to ask like a really basic question, then I want to talk about some of these things. So the question is, how have networks actually changed since the pandemic?
I think there's a couple of different dynamics that we're seeing. The most dramatic was during the pandemic, and Microsoft, because they have access to 122 billion emails. There's these sort of two fundamental elements of networks, the openness or the closedness, what we call bridging networks or bonding networks. And if you go back to the beautiful podcast that you did with Michael, he will take you to a proper lesson on that. But what we saw when the pandemic hit was we saw a shift from our bridging networks, open, diverse, cross-function, cross-geography, for all the reasons we would expect. They disappeared. They disintegrated. They evaporated, Danny. Microsoft measured the evaporation of bridging networks in March 2020. It is only starting to come back. What happened was we moved to what we refer to as the bonding or closed networks. Appropriately, we put our arms around the 7 to 9 people on our teams, and we said, we're going to get through this together. And when you look at the network connections, they shifted from a balance of open and closed to all closed, all what we refer to as bonding, and the absence of bridging. That actually produced incredible productivity because it's our bonding networks that get immediate results, but it threatened our ability to innovate, to give us access to new ideas for career development. The other thing that happened at that moment is we saw the acceleration of collaborative overload. And I know you talked with Rob. Rob's written a whole book on this. That collaborative overload, Microsoft had a study come out only a few months ago, and they said the collaborative overload is actually not much better than it was in March 2020. So I believe we're in a place where we're going to live with this always on, anywhere access. And so we need to really find this space of productive collaboration. So we have collaboration overload on one hand that is affecting wellness and well-being. And then we have to rebuild our bridging or open networks that had dissipated during the pandemic, because we need those to thrive. Those open networks are central to our ability to thrive, to get new ideas, to have our reputation spread, to engage from a change management. So once in the history of our species did we see such a dramatic, literally overnight change to our network as measured by people who can actually measure that.
So tell me what you think about this, because things changed during the pandemic, right? We're still having some class wars, basically, between people that want people in the office or office versus virtual and all kinds of things. How much of the hunkering down with the group do you think had to do with place? The water cooler, for example. Or how much was it because we were sharing this really horrific thing all together, and so we just bonded closely?
I think it happened because of the virtual nature. There's no cost in inviting an additional person to a Zoom or a Teams meeting, right? There's no cost. When we think about things like Slack or other things, Rob talks about this idea of the tragedy of the commons, which goes back to the 1800s, where they over-farmed common lands with farm animals because they didn't appreciate how much collaboration is often not measured within organizations. And so there's no cost for me to invite another person, to CC someone, to put them on a Slack. These are wonderful tools, but they're exasperating our collaboration overload. On one hand, we have technology sort of driving that. On the other hand, what I believe is it would be helpful for us to be more intentional about when and where and how we collaborate. So we're going to collaborate for new ideas. There is a proximity advantage. There is an opportunity. Coming together actually is, and Michael's research talks about this, is more likely to increase our ability to have a new insight, is more likely for us to have psychological safety because we see each other in 3 dimensions. We pick up on all sorts of cues that we don't pick up in lower fidelity technology. That being said, I believe asking people to come back into the office, to sit by themselves, to not collaborate with other people. So I think we need to find this next generation of how and why and the intentionality. There are really good and smart folks like Nick Bloom who would suggest that 2 to 3 days, if you go any more than that, you're not going to get a productivity lift from being together because you have individual stuff you do. So there's a lot of, I think, really exciting, really thoughtful research in this space. I hope organizations will continue to, rather than talk about these dictates, will become more intentional about saying, okay, why and how and when. And now let's actually build our workplaces. Let's build our work time to actually achieve the outcomes we want to achieve, whether that's career, innovation, execution, idea diffusion. We want to be intentional, begin with the outcome and then engineer the experience.
One of the things I love about you, Greg, is how optimistic you are, just about everything. We're going to go to the lightning round because we could talk about this forever, but we've got a time limit, unfortunately. So lightning round, obviously 3 questions to help get to know you just a little bit more.
I will take it away. These questions are all related to who, which we don't usually do. But since we were talking about networks, I thought who questions would be great for today. So first question, Greg, who would be the 3 guests at your dinner table if it could be anybody from any time?
My gosh, I think I love this question. And thank you for dusting off the who questions for me. I'm glad we get equal time in those. I appreciate that. So I do think there's a recency bias around this all the time. And I was actually thinking about this recently. So my influence. I've had the privilege to do quite a bit of work with the Walt Disney Company and our friend Chris King at Disney. I would love to meet and pick the brain of Walt Disney. I was flying back. We were in Europe for the Olympics, and we had a 10-hour plane ride coming back from Greece. I watched a series on Disney. The innovation beyond just parks, the innovation and the societal change that Walt Disney, and it wasn't just Walt, it was his brother Roy. If Walt didn't have Roy, it was other people in that network. I'd love to hear about how that network. The second person is I had the privilege to work for Diane Shinneman. Diane was the head of global ops and tech when I was at Merrill Lynch. I am such a fan. I admire her so much as a person. She had this incredible career as a very successful woman at the time in a very male-dominated investment banking world. And she was just so brilliant. She's still alive. She's still available. I probably should actually take this as an invitation to reach back out to her. But I would love to hear her story about how she leveraged her connections, because I know that that was true. And then the third is I miss the Bay Area. I'm such a Steph Curry fan. I love his character as a person. I believe part of the secret of the Warriors' success, apologize for not picking a team here, is the psychological safety that Steve Kerr and those players played. And it's folks who believe and trust in one another from that perspective. So I love this idea that good people can finish on top. And I think Steph Curry is one of those people. And I would love to get his perspective on how his character and how his connections contributed to his success.
I am obviously in the Bay Area and a big Warriors fan. And also Steve Kerr went to University of Arizona when I lived in Tucson, and we were huge Steve Kerr fans. And when he came to the Warriors, he was a legend when he was 21 years old in Tucson. And so it's so cool to see him as a leader as well. Maybe Steph could bring Steve to your dinner party.
It's psychological safety. It's collaboration. It's all the things that Amy Edmondson would tell us. It's all those things all happen. And I, anyway, huge fan. And I just love his character and the way he shows up and the work he does, even off the court.
So the next question kind of rolls into that. Who's influenced your work ethic the most?
I'm going to take a slightly different spin if I could on that. And that's because, again, a recency bias. Today is my dad's birthday. So I spent the day with him. We went to the Golf Museum, which is not too far from where we live. And I'm a second generation learning and talent leader. My dad did this for many, many years. I learned from him and spent time. Again, I had the privilege of having these connections early in my career, which helped influence the way I think about things. One of the capabilities I learned from my dad, I believe, is he is incredibly other focused. He has always been other focused. He begins by focusing on others. That quality is something that I deeply admire in him, and it's something that I've taken with me. So I don't know, honestly, where I got my work ethic. So that's my spin in the, I do appreciate and value, and I'm grateful for my dad. Happy birthday, Dad, if you're listening, which he will be, on that idea of being other focused. The power of reciprocity, as you know, Danny, is so powerful. And I think being other focused, it's a critical capability, especially in the future of work.
Thank you. Okay, we usually do a third question, but I am cognizant of our time limitations. So we're going to jump back into a few questions and then we'll wrap up. So we've talked about this whole concept of networks and some elements of the individual, but I want to go back to Danny's question, which I feel like we didn't really go after properly, which is whose responsibility is it for enabling networks? So is it the individual? Is it the organization? Is it HR? Like, how do we actually make these work?
The way I would think about that, again, maybe slightly differently, I see it less of a responsibility and more as an opportunity. I believe if you look at it as an opportunity as an individual, there are this incredible set of relational benefits that we get from people. Access to new ideas, access to career opportunities, access to new projects. We all, I know we all, I hope we all, and if you don't have one of these people, there are people you have in your network who you go to when you are down and you say, I just need you to support me. There are people you go to for access to new ideas. Really bringing that forward and being more intentional and saying, who is my network and what are the relational benefits I receive from those folks? Those are the benefits and opportunities for individuals. For teams and groups, it's unlocking what we know through who we know. And so if you're a team leader, if you're part of a team, whether that team might be the Golden State Warriors, the opportunity for creating psychological safety allows for ideas and expertise to flow. Again, no one better than our friend Amy Edmondson in doing this original work on psychological safety in hospitals. What we know is that when we have that psychological safety, when we care about each other, there are tremendous benefits. From an organization perspective, I think the benefits are accelerating change, encouraging innovation. Michael writes about that in his book. I think there's tremendous opportunities from a diversity inclusion. In the book, the folks at the Mayo Clinic wrote a very thoughtful, as only the Mayo Clinic can do, or as the Mayo Clinic always does, a really thoughtful work on, they did a network analysis of gender networks in a particular area. And they were very open about the differences they saw, very similar to Inga's work, and how they took action to ensure that there was inclusion around those. So there are these organizational benefits. The last area I would suggest, and again, we write about 9 specific use cases or areas in the book, is leadership development and leadership effectiveness. I think this one, my good friend Michael Campbell at Workday wrote the chapter on how they intentionally use network development in their director to VP program. They do a network analysis. You actually expose your network in a way that you reveal so that you can develop and look at the relational benefits. I believe that applying these types of tools in things like leadership development, change management, innovation, inclusion at the organization level. So I think there are opportunities at all 3. If your organization isn't doing it, as an individual, step up.
Okay.
I think there's tremendous opportunity when all 3 groups understand, reveal, develop, and leverage these networks. I don't think it can be any one. If your organization's not doing it, don't say, well, I guess I can't. Know your network, know what relational benefits you get from them. The research is clear. It will change your career trajectory.
So let's talk a little bit about that. In a lot of cases, organizational network analysis is not super accessible. Pen and paper, somebody doing it by themselves, absolutely. But data really makes it work really well. So talk to us a little bit about maybe how do you make it accessible, even if your organization isn't currently investing in it?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things. First of all, I hope you're not really doing it on pen and paper, Dan. I was going to say, you've gone back a generation even before. Although I do know people who put their network up on a whiteboard, right, so they can see it. And so I hope that there are 3 things. One, I hope that as we start to look at outcomes, that it becomes much more accessible. I am so grateful for all of the wonderful early pioneers in this space who helped us understand the network research. And I hope that the next evolution of that work is actually being more intentional around, I'm trying to improve our diversity and inclusion at this organization. How do we think about networks? So first, I hope it's about focusing on outcomes. And that's what we did. That was the centerpiece of the book. The second thing I would say, and Danny, you talked a little bit about this is both active and passive network. Active networks are incredibly powerful. It's typically what I've used where you ask people, who are the 20 people you go to get your work done? If you can't do that work, use passive signal. In the book, Phil Wilburn and Curtis Hampton from Workday talk about the fact that they use anytime feedback networks to identify, to reveal the network, the gratitude network, the value network, the culture network within the organization. And then my third is more of a hope moving forward. We talked about it. We touched on it a moment, is I'd love to see AI play a much stronger role. We don't have to look at all the arts and charts. You can look at them. You can have network analytic people look at them. But ideally, we write algorithms. We use AI to take that data and take such great work like Inga's work and Amy's work and Rob's work and Michael's work and actually just coach me on the answer. Hey, Greg, your network looks incredibly closed. That might be great if you are heads down delivering a project and good for you. but there are unintended consequences if you're in a heads up diffusion mode for your new ideas. I think outcomes, I hope, use passive signal if you can't do active. And I am plugging folks, not that technology is always the answer, but I'm excited about AI coaches who take our network data and actually convert it right to action for us and say, hey, here's the way you could think about your network to be more effective. I hope that future is right around our corner.
Well, Greg, we're going to have you back and talk about the tech when we're around that corner.
But in the meantime, we are going to wrap. We literally could do this conversation for so long. So first, thank you. But we're going to end with our typical question, which you have answered before, but you're in a different place now, in a different literal place, professional place, etc. So we're going to ask it again. And the question is what we call the purpose question. And it is, why do you do the work that you do?
Hopefully not too energetic about folks who are listening today. Hear my energy and my passion around this. Here's what I believe. As Stacey and Danny, you know, and so many people know, there is so much opportunity in this space right now for exactly the reasons we talked about. The drivers of work are pointing us here. The premium on our collaboration is continuing to explode. We have that opportunity. The agility required for organization is about to fuel. And again, I'll go back to my consulting 2x2. It is such a high value, under-leveraged area. I can't think of another area in HR, in human capital management, maybe even in business right now, that has so much potential for value and is so underappreciated and utilized. And as business people, those are the quadrants we go after. I really believe that this is a place. And what's so cool about it is it's in our control. Our connections are things we can build ourselves. We can be intentional about it. It's got an easy point of access. It's got crazy high value, and it is completely all low-hanging fruit. That's why I get excited specifically about this area right now. And I'm so grateful that you've given me the opportunity to share this message, this work with your audience.
Well, thank you for coming.
Thanks for being here, Greg.
Okay, that's a wrap for this episode of Workplace Stories. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to our podcast so that you can be the first to know about future episodes. For exclusive access to our research, insights, and a vibrant network of human capital leaders, consider joining the Red Thread Research community. Visit redthreadresearch.com to learn more and to take your workplace to the next level.